I don't know how you want to do this. I don't know how big your podcast is. Sometimes people like it when I post it on my channel. Sometimes people want it to be exclusive on their channel. I'm fine either way.
No, I'm fine with you posting yours, and I'll just do the same. I'll do a little introduction for mine, but not much of an introduction.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
That
Does that
sounds
work?
good.
Are we in the side by side view?
Yeah,
Recording?
would you like it the
No, I like that. I like the blogging hits.
Okay.
Okay, very good. Um, on my end, I'll say welcome to the Common Toad podcast. Tonight we are talking to a very interesting guy. His name is Paul Vander Klay. He is a pastor in California, a member of the Christian Reformed Church, I believe is correct.
That's correct.
There's a lot of names that and that's correct, right? Okay.
That
I was
is
reading
correct.
up a little bit of history on it. And we're here tonight when I first got in touch with you, and you gave me a couple dates that you could be available. I looked at my calendar and I thought, January 6th, it's Epiphany, so that sounds like a nice peaceful night. Nothing possibly could be going on. so tonight, I should say, I don't know when this will go up on either our ends, but tonight we're in the middle of the night that people stormed Congress, which is it broke in and actually got into the chamber and it smashed some windows and stuff. So that's kind of the backdrop of what's going on today. This is not at all what I plan on talking about, but I just thought I'd mention that, and it might seep into the conversation a little bit, I think, just because what I wanted to talk to you about is belief in general and reasons for belief and levels of devotion to beliefs, right? And also when beliefs meet realities. And, the segue might write itself. So
I could see that.
So I'll start just by saying I started watching your videos. I can't remember exactly when, but I came across you. I think like many people do, because you made a lot of Jordan Peterson videos as the phenomenon started to take off, and I watched it not from the beginning, but I watched it hit his rise, pretty early on, and I found it very interesting, and I found a lot of it worth listening to. Other parts of it kind of made me reach for my wallet a little bit. But one thing I liked about it was that there was a willingness to break down some of the walls between what we think of as like secular philosophy and religion. And I liked that. And that was, that kind of came on the heels of the new atheist movement, all that kind of stuff. So I liked a little bit more of a serious discussion going on between people of faith and people of no faith, or people who like myself, who are very firm fence sitters, agnostics and stuff. And then coming across your videos, I pretty quickly saw that there was someone who was able to grasp some of the most interesting parts of what Peterson was talking about, the mythology, how real is myth, that kind of thing. And also you were obviously conversant in Christian theology, obviously, but a lot of just philosophy in general. And that was not the sort of acquaintance I had had with religion as a kid, for the most part. And that was very interesting to me, and it made me think, oh, good, this kind of opens up a whole different world of people who I can hear ideas from and maybe bounce ideas off of. So I guess what I like, I know you've maybe done this before, but if you just give like just a little bit of biographical background, like kind of where you come from, how you came to be doing what you're doing right now as a pastor.
Okay. Well, I'm a third generation minister in the Christian Reformed Church. So my grandfather was one, and my father was a pastor. And my father took the first church that he took was for 36 years. It had been sort of a gospel mission type enterprise in Paterson, New Jersey, among African Americans who had moved up from the South into the industrial North for jobs between the world wars. And then by 1960, the people in the Christian Reformed churches of the area wanted to sort of transform this mission into something of a church. And so they called my father straight out of seminary. He had grown up in the Midwest, in mostly farming communities. And thinking back, I can't imagine he had had any experience with African Americans at all. And so he transformed this little mission into a congregation, which was mostly Black. And that was where I grew up. But also on the other side, the Christian Reformed Church had a long history of Christian day schools. And the Christian Reformed Church had tended to be quite Dutch in its background. And so I'd go to day school with a lot of descendants of Dutch immigrants, and weekends living in and worshiping in a mostly Black community. And so that really set me up to sort of understand at a very implicit level cultures from a different perspective. So I spent my first 18 years or so doing that. Then I went to Calvin College, which is the college owned by my denomination, and studied history, and then went to seminary at Calvin Seminary in Grand Rapids as well, and eventually was married and was in the Dominican Republic as a missionary for my denomination for a little over 6 years, and then came back to North America and eventually took this congregation here in Sacramento, California. And the context was similar to my father's, but the racial dynamics, the social dynamics in California is a little bit different than in the New York metropolitan area where I grew up. And so the cultural spectrum was quite a bit broader. So not just African Americans, but Hispanics, Asian communities, significant Chinese community, Japanese community, Southeast Asian communities, and in the particular neighborhood where my church is, a lot of different ethnic groups. Plus, in this neighborhood, which has been in decline since the 80s, fair number of group homes, homeless people. A lot of that I was quite familiar with in growing up in Patterson, and also worked with Haitians in the Dominican Republic, mostly Haitian illegal immigrants who are laborers in the DR. And so, but at the same time, always had an interest in theology, philosophy, and sort of blogged, wrote in various listservs. And so it was always engaged with things of the mind. So I was just kind of doing what I've always done. I'd often take a few years to really focus on an intellectual that I thought was important. I took a number of years taking a close look at Tim Keller and his ministry in Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City. And then Jordan Peterson came on the scene. And the first video I saw of Jordan Peterson was the suspender video, where students were angry about his refusal to use certain pronouns. And what impressed me about him was that he sort of kept his cool, and he didn't just yell back at them. And he was trying to make a rather sophisticated point in the middle of a mob. Nuance is usually the first casualty in any mob scene. And that sort of drove me deeper. And it very quickly connected me. I intuitively began to connect him with a far deeper problem that I struggled with as a pastor, which was the divorce between kind of the technological scientific world we live in public and this historical world, a world of the Bible, let's say, that I preach about on Sunday. So, for example, if I'm preaching on Genesis 1, and my denomination is sort of a moderate denomination because it originally was sort of an ethnically cohered. So it was conservative enough that it wanted to take the Bible seriously, but it was also European enough that you would learn about evolution at Calvin College. And that was always a source of tension and friction.
Yep.
And so on Sunday mornings, people read Genesis 1 about separating light and darkness. And there's this firmament, which is sort of a bowl. There's waters above and waters below, and the sun, moon, and stars are within the firmament. And then everybody at the same time goes out. And if I would ask them, is the world round? They'd say, of course it is. And say, how do you know? Well, we see the pictures from the moon. And so here we've got these two worldviews that
Yeah.
people are living with side by side, and mostly sort of either avoiding or having conflict over the places where these two worldviews don't fit together. And I didn't I listened to Jordan Peterson, and especially when the biblical series started, that was fascinating, because here was someone talking about the Bible in a way that the liberals weren't talking about it, in a way the conservatives weren't talking about it. It was a different way. And I saw at least a potential in that way of finding some new ways for these two worlds to fit together. And I also immediately noticed that I was just reading comment sections on Reddit or on YouTube videos. People were saying things like, gosh, I was a big fan of Sam Harris and I thought Christianity was stupid. And then I listened to Jordan Peterson and now I want to read the Bible. I'm even thinking about visiting a church. And I'm like, what's with that?
Yeah,
Because
as a pastor, your ears kind of pricked up.
exactly. And so I'd also been, for years, I'd been writing on a blog. I'd do quite a bit of writing. I was thinking about maybe writing a book, but just working in a local church, I realized that if I had wrote a book, no one would read it because so much of the population doesn't read books. So I was sort of interested in YouTube, and a member of my congregation who wanted him and I to have a TV program on public access downtown. I wasn't going to do that. So I said, well, let me just take videos of us talking and I'll throw it up on the YouTube channel that I'd used to record sermons so that if people missed a sermon, they could find it.
Yeah.
And so that was the beginning of the Freddie and Paul show. And so I
I
was
think
already
I've seen an episode or two of the Freddie.
yeah. So I was already playing around with YouTube a little bit. And then I thought, I was at the time reading Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And I thought, there's something about this Jordan Peterson moment and YouTube. There's some connection there. So then I thought, what if I would just make a little video about why I think Jordan Peterson is important? And I did. And then I had 15 subscribers on my YouTube channel for about 5 years. And I wake up the next day and I had 200. And
Yeah.
it's like, and you got to realize this church is a small church. And it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. Well, maybe I'll make another video. And then there were 500. And when it hit 2,000, you can find the video where I said, well, this is kind of enough. I was looking for some more conversation partners. I wasn't looking for anything bigger. And then people began to email me and tell me their stories and ask, can we Skype? Can we talk? Okay, I'm a pastor. This is what I do. So I started doing that. And then I began to notice that the conversations were coming around and around to the same subject. So I asked, can I record this? And yes. And then after the conversation, I'd say, would you mind if I shared it on my channel? People be okay. And then that took on a life of its own. And then people began writing me because they wanted to not only have these conversations with me, but they wanted to have these conversations with me publicly so that others could join in the conversation. And that led to a local meetup group, and that led to a Discord server, and everything has just sort of kept going for the last 3 years. And I've continued to, my monologue videos are sort of me thinking out loud about what I'm thinking about. And the conversation videos sort of have grown on their own. And then when the Discord server started, I noticed that people started starting their own YouTube channels and doing exactly what I had been doing. And that had all just sort of continued to grow into a little community. And a community not of just Christians, but of people across the spiritual, religious, non-religious, irreligious spectrum, of wanting to have good faith, honest, searching conversations. And that in some ways is the center of what we've been doing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I remember you saying somewhere that you like spending quite a bit of time talking to non-believers, and in fact, you do spend a lot of time talking to non-believers. Is that something that came out of this, or was that something that you had always been the case with you? And is it something that when you watched your father preach and do his work as a pastor, is that a similar approach that he took, or did you find yourself in a totally different context in that sense?
Where we are culturally in our country makes it extraordinarily difficult for Christian ministers to often have productive conversations with people outside the church.
Yeah.
Part of what I was involved with for my first 15 or 20 years before this whole thing was involved with was helping recruit church planters and helping support them as they planted churches. And many church planters very quickly learned that if they want to grow a church, not simply by attracting other Christian people, but by actually engaging in important conversations, what they'd often do is go into coffee shops and try to find one way or another to have a meaningful conversation with someone who is not interested in church at all.
Hmm.
Because part of the problem of church is that so often you are paid by the people you are talking to, and what that develops is a very insular community.
Right.
And so the conversations going on in church are very different from the conversations going on out there in the street. That's an enormous problem for pastors, because often the pastors are the most insular people in the congregation. Most of the other people in church have day jobs, neighbors, and so what they develop in themselves is sort of it's like the daughter of a friend of mine. He grew up in Puerto Rico. He married an Anglo woman. He lived in Sacramento. And so he decided for his kids to learn Spanish, he would speak Spanish to his children. And because I had been a missionary in the Dominican Republic and they were my neighbors, his little girl was just a darling little girl. And I always saw him speak Spanish to her. And so I started speaking Spanish to her. And she looked at me with a scowl, because this language was her special language for her with her daddy. And
You were
here
you were intruding.
that's right. Here I was intruding. She looked at me. She was like a 3-year-old, gave me a scowl and turned away. It's like, I'm not doing that with that man.
That's funny.
But that's what happens in church. And for, Christianity, which is a proselytizing religion, you can't
Yeah.
think of a bigger problem where you have these insular communities and they're so deeply out of touch with what else is going on, especially the leadership of the church. So whereas I could go weeks and months without a substantive, meaningful conversation, a good faith conversation with someone who would just be willing to tell me that they thought Christianity was full of shit,
Hmm.
now I've got more than I have time to listen to. And that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I have a sense too that there are people on either side, Christians and non-Christians, who, there's kind of a mutual fear of the like George Costanza's universes colliding thing. I mean, there's a kind of a feeling like I don't want to get there. It's not that that I'm intolerant of your belief. It's just that if I get stuck in a conversation with you, I'm not going to know what to say, because I don't even know if I have the language to talk to you, anymore. And what I think one of the interesting things that came out of, at least in the United States, out of the new atheist movement, Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris and Dennett and all that, even though those confrontations were so, in some ways, it was all about creating the drama of confrontation, and there were sparks and sometimes some insults and stuff like that, and some straw men, right? But it almost was like the opening line in a person-to-person conversation where you say something that kind of the other person's like taken aback and they're like, whoa, who's this guy here? But then you go home and you think about it. It's like, oh, that was an interesting thing. Like, that doesn't usually happen to me. I don't usually get talked to like that, right? And then there's a natural curiosity that comes out of that. And so it seems like this second or whatever wave of discussion between people of faith and no faith, or people who don't know what they think, is more like, okay, we had that initial like collision. Maybe we can like talk a little bit deeper, right? And so you started noticing that people who on the surface, having no reason whatsoever to be interested in Christian ideas, actually were very interested. Obviously, I mean, how does a lecture from some obscure, controversial, Canadian psychologist get millions and millions of views? It can't just be the car crash appeal of culture wars, right?
No.
And that's what I think people don't maybe understand when they
Yeah.
just happen to see. I mean, Jordan Peterson says a lot of things that piss people off, and I get that, and I even understand why some of the time. But it's interesting once you get into the dynamics of what's actually being discussed underneath it. You start to see that there's a lot of ideas that people have been like pent up in people that they're wanting to get out. Does that jive with the discussions that you've had and
Very, very much so. I think Peterson, on one hand, for a group of people, was saying a bunch of things better than they could, that they sort of felt, and he clarified for it. And that's what gave him, I mean, there's some social war, there's some culture war stuff in there. But also another thing that he demonstrated was that there is and he said this many times, there is an audience out there that was able to interested in long form, serious thought and discussion and good faith conversations.
Right.
I think, what you said a little bit earlier, I think is exactly right. I think for a lot, as just in a social setting, let's say at a Christmas party or something like that, where there might be, coworkers of my wife, and when I'm outside the Christian bubble, I would often find someone, so you're a minister. Yeah. It takes a little while for them to, okay, I want to know what kind of minister you are, because I see them on TV and I don't necessarily want to find myself trapped in a situation that I can't get out of. But I do have some questions, and I'd kind of like to talk, but I'd like to be able to get out fast if I can, in case this gets bad the way I've seen other things like that go bad. And so part of what I think happened, especially with the conversations on YouTube, is that people could see, and this was partly Peterson too, and partly what I was attracted to him for. I could see him treating, on one hand, he had a lot of pent up frustration with certain groups of people, but when they got face to face with them, he didn't just explode at them. He eagerly tried to pursue a productive conversation with someone with whom he had a difference. Mm-hmm. And he showed a capacity for that. And so I think, besides just my response videos to Jordan Peterson's work, once people saw that here I'm talking to an atheist or someone who's interested in Buddhism or someone who thinks pastors are full of shit, and okay, you think pastors are full of shit. Okay. I mean, I'm not mortified by that. I'm not going to be defensive.
You can live with that.
Yeah. And so, well, tell me how I'm full of shit, because I know myself, and sometimes I am. So you can actually help me by, if you've got some insight in the ways that I'm falling short, you're actually blessing me. So let's talk. And I think once people saw, once we were able to model that conversation, more and more people said, I want to get in on that. And that's what's happened.
Now, when you talk about inevitably you're talking generally, but when you talk about a group of people, Christians who believe a certain set of things versus people who are maybe non-religious, you're talking about people, when you have discussions with them, do you find that in either case, there's something in their lives that either they perceive or don't perceive is kind of lacking lacking in their understanding of the world. And I mean this from either end, you know what I mean? Because I've had this, because I grew up, I would say vaguely Catholic, you know, not, no, like in the old days or anything. Very moderately religious family. Grew up in the Catholic Church a little bit, quit before confirmation, and then went on to experience for a few years in my early teens some of the more charismatic evangelical types that you might see on television. Somewhat out of curiosity, somewhat out of just wanting to be in on something that other people maybe weren't in on. And, you know, like the real shout and holler, I don't know how much shouting and hollering that you do in your church, but the, like, you know, hands getting laid on, falling backwards, speaking in tongues, Pentecostal stuff, all that stuff, which was quite an interesting experience, especially from basically an outsider. And even at the time when I was young and looking back, I still don't know quite why I did it. That's the weird thing. And I don't know what it was about that, because, you know, I would walk through some of these meetings and I'd hear somebody talking about the Big Bang, you know, being like, yeah, the Big Bang, it's God said bang and it happened. That's what the Big Bang was. And I'm thinking, oh, geez, you know, but there was obviously some kind of appeal there. And I don't know what it was. I still have a hard time articulating that. So clearly, you know, and you could probably, you know, in just in the same way that Christians are quite eager, a lot of them are, to talk about, just have an interest in, you know, the outside world, the world of non-belief, this strange world of actually, I mean, because it's a huge difference believing that there's a God that has everything ordered and that there is life after death versus believing not. It's an enormous difference. There's no way around that. But there are curiosities that both sides have of the other, which I wonder if that speaks to a kind of like lack that they have respectively in their own understanding of life and of their lives, you know?
I think that's true. And I think you're exactly right that it goes both ways, because it often surprises people to hear that the period of per capita church attendance in America reached its peak during the Cold War. A lot of people imagine that, well, back in the 18th century, everyone used to go to church and it's just been slowly going down since then. That's not true at all.
Mm-hmm.
It reached its peak during the Cold War. And so another thing that has happened has been the rise of course, first the printing press, but then radio and television. And it used to be that, at least in the Western Hemisphere, the Bible had a privileged position and was quite well known by many, many people in places in Europe that had state churches. Mm-hmm. Religious education was just part of the school curriculum. It didn't mean you went to church, but you were taught something about the Bible. And in the United States, that was true as well, but more on a free market system. And that has fallen away dramatically in the last 50, 60, 70 years. And what that has meant is exactly the dynamic that you are noting, where you've got now people who are living next to each other, and there's this, what one group of people says is a really important thing in their life, to the degree that they're giving away 5 or 10% of their income. They're not going to coffee shops on Sunday morning. They might not be doing sports on Sunday, you know, all of this stuff, which used to be fairly ubiquitous. Yeah. Everybody sort of understood a little bit of what those religious people were doing. And so you didn't have to go look, but now suddenly you've got both sides, and there's been a pretty significant decline in identification with Christianity since the end of the Cold War. And that's especially accelerated in the last 20 years. And so 20 years is about exactly it's a generation. And so now you've got all of these people who have grown up with very little firsthand experience of Christianity in the church. And yet you have all of these buildings around. And
probably cultural conventions that we don't even know about.
That's right. And so both sides have been curious, and it's just been a little bit, I think, because of the the increasing, let's say, thickness of mass communication, television, radio, and now the internet. Although the internet, I think, has been part of this change, because mass communication was all one way: newspapers, television, radio.
Right.
And now suddenly with the internet, not only do I wonder what's going on in that strange building across the way, now suddenly I'm bumping into religious people of all different kinds of stripes all over the place. So I think you're exactly right that there's a lot of curiosity and pent up demand. And usually when it comes to information transfers, the internet is a really good tool for information transfer.
I was thinking this the other day when, just imagining sitting back in a Catholic church when I was younger and thinking about, there's a liturgy and everything, and everybody's saying the same words and everything. But I wonder how different each person's conception of what they were thinking about really was. And it's something that Hitchens, I think, kind of used honestly as a deflection, but he would say, I find that when I argue with Christians, there are as many gods as there are people I'm arguing with, and there is something to that. I mean, yes, I think about it just in terms of just on the most basic level of language, that some people are talking about a story which is happening in their mind that they're familiar with, and not really beyond that, and in their imaginations, which is extremely powerful. And that's part of the interest of talking about what myth really is and how real it is. And in the subconscious. And then there are people who are talking about a story that involves something which they believe actually literally took place physically in our world, right? And it's still unfolding in its physical reality. And there are some people who think about that only on when they're prompted to on Sunday or whenever they go to church. And there's some people who think about it all the time. And it kind of dawned on me, without being a Christian, I feel I kind of think about it more. I think about religion an awful lot for some reason, and maybe more so than people who would call themselves Christians. But it all comes down to this question of how we organize our minds internally, because there's all these different descriptions of what we believe respectively, and I don't even know, like the two versions that I say, the version of something that's the version of the story in the imaginative power versus the real belief in the physical reality of what happened. I don't even know if those two versions are different or the same. I don't even know where those two cross over, and that is where human language breaks down for me. Like the Chomskyan view of language is like communication is language is used for communication, but its primary existence is like actually for organizing internal thought. I don't know. That's not necessarily a mainstream view. It's the Chomskyan view of it, and that's what came first as a way of organizing thought. And communication is something that almost like a satellite use, something like a peripheral, and when there's a kind of a parallel discussion of that in Christianity too. I think talking about the logos and everything, and I was wondering if you could, when we start talking about things like logos and what Christians mean when they talk about the Word and God was the Word and all that sort of stuff. It's extremely interesting and mysterious to me, but I can never quite bend my head around or wrap my head around what they're talking about. What does that mean to you when I say that? Because it seems like it's very much just associated with our brains and the way language operates in our species, which is unlike any other species.
Well, that quote comes from the prologue of the Gospel of John, and there's actually a tremendous amount of history behind that. And what John does in that prologue is in some ways really connect Athens and Jerusalem, because the John scripture, the Hebrew scriptures, begin in Genesis 1, where God speaks the world into existence out of the tohu wavohu. let there be light, and there was light. And to give an indication that this isn't just simply labeling physical things. He doesn't call the light light in Genesis 1. He calls the light day. And it's like, well, wait a minute. What's happening here? And so the beginning of the Gospel of John then says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, I just said that in English, but the Greek word logos, I actually just had a little conversation with someone who told me, said, in the Reina Valera, which is the Spanish, in the beginning was the verb. And if I say verb instead of word in English, word sounds like a noun, and verb sounds more, it's a noun, but it's more like a verb. And
Yeah.
so right away you get the sense that this is getting complicated.
Yeah.
And the logos from Heraclitus through the Stoics, and the Platonic tradition, Middle Platonism, and then eventually all the way to Neoplatonism. This logos was in Greek philosophy something of like an organizing principle that in fact began to take on instantiation and agency to the degree that it almost became a second God. And so when the beginning of the Gospel of John makes that sentence, he takes Athens and Jerusalem and puts them right next to each other and makes an assertion that both Stoics, there was one of the main philosophical traditions at play in the Eastern Roman Empire, and in the Western Empire for that matter too, and this growing group of renegade Jews who were, spreading in popularity in the empire, begins to put the conversation together. And so actually I just preached on this last Sunday. And so what happens during these liturgical seasons is you wind up preaching on the same text over and over. So as a preacher, so I was like, okay, how can I get into this text yet again?
I always wonder that for people who've been doing it for 30, 40 years.
and so I dig into a different little part of the passage. And so I was getting into, so logos is this Greek term, lego is to speak. So that's the verbalized form of the word. And so then digging into that and some of the etymology of the word, basically to speak has lego before it was kind of the physicality of the word was about gathering. And that on top of all of the Jordan Peterson stuff that I had looked at, I'm in quite a bit of conversation with another University of Toronto scholar named John Vervaeke, who's been very active in this little corner of the internet where we've been he's not a Christian, he's a non-theist, and, but we've been working on a lot of these issues. Jordan Peterson in his first biblical lecture talks about the fact that we watch each other act things out. And, eventually the language comes. And I mentioned to my church on Sunday, let's describe this room that we're in. Well, in any given room, there is more, you could spend more time than you have to live just focusing on the complexity of that room, because you can look at it historically, metaphorically. You can go down to the atomic level where now the location of the particular particles are uncertain because of quantum mechanics. I mean, you can exhaust a lifetime just describing one room. But if I say we are in the sanctuary, what I have done is I have taken thousands of years of history and meaning and all of those things, and I've compressed it all the way down into one word. Okay. And so that's what words do. I also often use the illustration that if I'm in the church building and a dog starts running around, suddenly there'll be chaos in the room because everybody will be like, why is there a dog running around in the church? And then if I say it's my dog, and it got out, suddenly order is dispelled and chaos emerges, and everybody can stop watching the dog and continue to listen to the sermon. So what the logos does is that the logos brings order out of chaos. And what the logos does is the logo compresses a way too large world down to something which is intelligible and manageable and relatable. And so that's just two aspects of what the logos does. And then John goes and says that the Logos took on flesh and lived among us. So now suddenly he's identifying a single human being with the organizing principle of all of creation. I mean, and he does that in a sentence.
That's a big step.
It's a big step. And so what, and that's why, you know, your intuitions are exactly right. When the word became flesh and dwelt among us, what the Gospel of John does is take this entire tradition of Jerusalem and Athens and brings it together and says the interpretive key of all of human history was born in, you know, Bethlehem and grew up in Nazareth and was crucified outside of Jerusalem. And his followers believe he rose out of the grave and ascended into heaven and now reigns over human history.
Well, that I'll have to go back and re-listen to 2 or 3 more times. But I have to say, that's quite good. I haven't really thought of it quite in the way that you said. Is the idea of the Logos being something that, in some ways, takes a whole host of historical notions and condenses it into this one thing that we all have some kind of. Reminds me a little bit of what, like, I think I remember G.K. Chesterton saying something about before we learned that we shouldn't fight each other for this moral reason or that moral reason. We understood that we shouldn't fight each other in the sacred place, right? That there was some like intuition where like, oh, normally I would try to kill you. I'd try to take your wife or your food or something like that. But we're going to agree to just not do that because right now we're in the sacred place.
Because we're in the sanctuary. And again, just that word has enormous power. And no, that's right.
That's interesting. Well, where else did I want to go with this? Well, I want to ask you about, I want to bring in a little bit of like your real world experience as a pastor in a place that has had actually a lot of diversity, some poverty and some homelessness. I saw you do a video a few months ago about having to call the cops on a homeless man who was a friend of yours over the years and who kind of used the church as a place to stay and sleep up against and everything for years. A very moving video, actually. I wanted to bring that kind of, because you have that real world, somewhat gritty experience of actual life happening instead of just understanding things in the abstract. And how do you find that you're able to translate these notions, these Christian notions, into actual reality on a day-to-day basis?
Well, you know, when we started, you described your experience of religion as not being terribly connected with philosophical, and a truth about that is that, as we said also, in some ways, religion is practice first. Let me use an example. The one of the 10 commandments, honor your father and mother that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. It's an interesting commandment because there's sort of a promise, and the Apostle Paul picks up on that. There's a promise tacked on to this commandment. It's not a threat, but it's a promise. And scholars have noted for a long time, well, that's quite interesting. And if you think about it in terms of psychology, developmental psychology, children who grow up watching their parents care for their own parents will likely grow up to care for their parents because they saw it happen. And even if no one said, here's a rule, and unless you follow through with this rule, God's going to get you, you don't even have to say that. One of the things about us is that we, as children, before we can even construct narratives and reasons, and before really half of our brain comes online in the way that we understand it now, we absorb the first drafts of our world around us, and a big part of that are our parents. And that then in many ways gets into religion. Part of the difficulty of, let's say, Protestantism in its focus on the Bible alone is that language is always only one half of the thing. And
Mhm.
so deep within Christian traditions are practices that might not be written down, but are carried over from generation to generation and generation and passed down, sort of like parents taking care of children, watching their parents take care of the grandparents will likely grow up to feed their parents so that they can live long in the land because their children are taking care of them and there's no social security.
Yeah.
So I was, so like I mentioned, I'm a third generation Christian Reformed minister. And my grandfather pastored during the Depression and then during the Second World War. And then he took a church in Canada after the Second World War. And there were mostly Dutchmen coming over after the war. And those Dutchmen had lived through the German occupation, which was not a gentle occupation. And they didn't have the language for it. But I would imagine many of those Dutch immigrants came over with what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
And I remember growing up with stories my grandmother would tell of how poorly many of the people in those church treated each other. And so a good bit of what my grandfather did was if a Dutchman showed up in this little town in Ontario, Owen Sound, Ontario, the train conductor would call my grandfather because he knew he was the pastor, and the pastor would come over and take the family into
Mhm.
his home and give them a bed to stay in and try to figure out, who was the sponsor. And, this is what pastors have always done. And also my grandmother would tell stories of how hobos would show up at their door. And the hobo, of course, is kind of a Depression era word, people who would ride the rails. And then one day she noted outside on the street, she noted a sign on the telephone pole just outside the street, sort of a star. And she went down the street and she saw that it was like Mark, 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 and then star. And what that meant was from the railroad station to my grandparents' house, the hobos had marked, you can get a meal here. And
Wow.
so they would knock on the door, and my grandmother would, they were quite poor themselves because the churches didn't have money, and she would fix a meal and she would feed these people. So my father grew up doing that. And then he goes to Patterson. He doesn't know anything about Black folks, but I grew up helping him, oh gosh, move people, deliver food, help people out of a scrape, do something like this. Many of the people were, there's mental illness involved. The church had started a drug rehab facility next to the church. So I grew up just, you know, recovering heroin addicts were just the people we went to church with.
How did
And
that how did that how did that feel to you as you were doing it? What was your experience at the time?
as a kid, you don't know any different. This is the only
Yeah.
life you've lived. And so
Yeah.
to me, it was natural.
Yeah.
And a lot of these recovering heroin addicts were pretty fun guys. They had seen a lot of the world. They had a good sense of humor. I mean, they're almost all African American. They liked music and they liked kids. And so we'd have church campouts. And so we'd go camping together. And so then when, I actually, after my time in the Dominican Republic, had off two job offers, and one of them was to this church. And I remember visiting the search committee of this church, and I sat down with them, and I very quickly realized this church was kind of a mess, and they didn't have their act together. And then my first day, I showed up here at the church to sit in my office and start preparing sermons and calling people and the stuff that pastors do. There's a homeless woman sitting in the middle of the parking lot with a suitcase. And so what do? You bring her in, you see if
Mhm.
she needs something to eat, you talk to her, and you see if you can help. But again, watching, my grandfather did this, my father did this. This is just what you do. Now there are Bible stories about it,
Yeah.
but you just keep doing what you know how to do. And these traditions live generationally. And so I remember when I got here, some people were all concerned. Oh no, what, is the pastor going to want to get out of this church because he has to deal with all of these homeless people and all these mentally ill people? But to me, that was what the church is for. If 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 the homeless and the mentally ill can't at least expect a degree of civil treatment when they walk into a church building, then should that church have Jesus' name on it?
Yeah.
So this to me, this is what churches are supposed to do. And I think culturally, we know that.
Yeah. Did you ever have a period of growing up where you strayed from the church at all, or were you've been in it straight through?
I've been in it straight through. I wasn't really the rebellious kind. Um, there I think my father had some regret about how much of, let's see, my childhood and the childhood of my sisters he missed out on, because if you are someone who can lend a hand in a very poor area of a city, there are innumerable people who would like you to lend a hand. Some need it more than others. And so he had some regrets, maybe that he worked too much, but I, you know, I wasn't bitter or resentful, and I didn't really want to be a local church pastor. I was much more interested in education, and I thought going overseas as a foreign missionary, I would probably be teaching seminary or something like that. But then I wound up in a mission field where the average pastoral education was about a second grade education from Haiti. So I didn't get a chance to. I brought all these theological books with me, and I received far more of an education from those Haitian pastors than I ever gave them. Because as a 20 something fresh out of seminary, I had a lot to learn about life,
Yeah.
and I learned it in spades from them.
Do you think ultimately? I mean, I think we have a mutual admiration for Tom Holland, the historian, and he has a book that has made some real waves, Dominion, over the last year and a half or so, and that kind of talks about how a lot of what we take to be um, just sort of normal human behavior actually is totally informed by Christianity, whether we know it or not. And he contrasts it with his scholarly work and popular work too, as a historian, with the ancient world and how alien he realized it was to him. And he looked into why that was, and he kind of discovered that it had quite a lot to do with the flowering of Christianity. I can follow that argument pretty easily. I don't have a problem with, I mean, if when people say, look at all of the wars and the suffering and stuff that Christianity has caused, it's in that book, it's in Dominion, it's all over the place. I can look at that and say, yeah, but what compared to what, kind of, so I understand that argument, that if you just strip it down to the gospel message, that's a I mean, considering human history and human ideas, that's a pretty straightforward force for good, I think. But what do you say to the person who just kind of doubts that the message is like potent enough to actually change people's behaviors? Because we have a lot of history now to look back on. We can look at 2,000 years of Christianity, and we can look at many more thousands of years, at least of recorded history, not that much more than that, but and we can see the moral attempts made to either perfect humanity or improve it. What do you say to the person that just says, okay, people, even if people know what they're supposed to be doing, they just kind of don't do it? And so far, the cudgel of Bible has not been enough to,
Yeah. I don't argue with them, because one of the things you learn very quickly, we talked about sort of the inside and outside the church perspective. Sometimes, especially in a political realm, people will look at a pastor and say, oh, there's that pastor, and he believes he is against abortion, or he's against same-sex marriage, and he's got all of those people that he's talking to, and he's all going to convince them to be against it. Well, a couple of things. Number one, often pastors are more greater captives to their church congregations than anyone else. And often the pastors who don't reflect the beliefs of their church often find themselves without a job pretty quickly. For the reason that people imagine that, and this is a strange fantasy that people hold given the absolute ubiquity of the evidence, that you can change people's mind by telling them what's right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
People don't work that way. I mean, is it a mystery that smoking causes cancer? Is it a mystery that you are healthier if you eat right and exercise? These are not esoteric secret beliefs. We are bombarded with them all the time. And it doesn't mean that bombardment is completely ineffective, but human beings are by no means that direct. We are utterly, utterly complex. And so much of what Christianity teaches is so difficult and in some ways so counterintuitive that I think it's frankly a miracle any of it is believed or tolerated at all. Because, one of the most honest things I ever heard on Christianity was Jonathan Stewart on The Daily Show, who once made a comment to people, which I have this experience a lot, kind of says, Jesus Christ, have you ever actually read the Sermon on the Mount? There was a Christian who was teaching at Texas A&M in the heart of the Bible Belt in the 1980s, of students that she could reasonably imagine, many of whom were raised in Christian homes, and in a freshman English class. And she handed out the Sermon on the Mount and just kind of said, here's the Sermon on the Mount, read it and write a response paper. Most of the students hated it. And for the obvious reason for one example, which would be turn the other cheek.
Yeah. That's a
you
tough
might
one.
watch movies that think you turn the other cheek. Someone will say, oh, how noble. No, you usually get hit again. That's what happens. And so the whole thing about Jesus, it's pretty amazing. It has not only endured, but people are still say, oh, he was a great moral teacher. And I think, have you read any of the New Testament? Because that's a pretty weird takeaway.
I love the part too in the New Testament where the rich young man comes to Jesus and says, "Oh, I love what you're doing. This is great. How can I help?" And he says, "Well, you just give up everything you have and follow me." And he said, and I hear a lot of like contemporary life, people looking to do good or have this feeling that we should be doing what's right, and the guy's just like, what can I do really? It's like,
can't I make a reasonable donation?
Yeah. You just, like I said, you give up everything and then follow me. And he's like, oh, God.
But
he goes away upset.
Even that story, I mean, earlier you asked about, this disconnect between people. And this is why, people whine and complain that, well, maybe the church is going away, maybe Christianity is going under. I don't think so, because here's someone who had earnestly, according to the account, devoted his life to being a good person. And he comes to the point to recognize it's insufficient.
Right.
So then what will you do?
That's a big thing, right?
Yeah.
Everybody wants to feel like, and does feel like, no, I shouldn't say that, but people definitely want to feel like they're a good person. And that if they're doing something wrong, it's not because they're a bad person, it's because of some kind of circumstance that gave them, they had no choice. But they definitely, at their heart, are a good person, and they need to make sure that they know that themselves and everybody else knows that. Yeah, what happens when even, trying to be pretty good and stuff, when you see what happens in the world out there, it's like, oh yeah, what I'm doing is just insufficient. It just is insufficient. It's not enough.
Yeah.
That's a tough one. I mean, I guess there are two ways to look at that, where you say, well, Christianity is it's pie in the sky. It's not it's not made for human beings, right? That is one interpretation.
Yeah.
You can say, well, that's, that kind of thing is just, it's for saints. Where Orwell has that line in his essay on Gandhi that was it saints, human beings should not don't feel like saints, but saints have never really felt much like being human beings themselves, it seems like. And then he kind of criticizes Gandhi a little bit, but there's this idea of like, okay, let's not get crazy here. I'm a person. I didn't ask to be the way that I am. I'm endowed with these deficits, and you can only expect so much. But yet at the same time, there's this sense that like, but I am making decisions all the time that are making the world worse. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I guess that's the tension. I wanted to be before, well, I still have it. I wanted to tie in this with just the question of I guess what is commonly referred to as woke culture and everything. Because when we bring up Jordan Peterson and just the intellectual dark web group that emerged in the last few years, they had they had some pretty good critiques of the kind of the excesses of woke culture on the left, and kind of and even now kind of the corporatization of it, like of companies who clearly don't have any particular moral insights to lend anybody, but they just are kind of doing it to cover themselves because it's locked into the culture enough, right? Yeah. And I enjoyed some of those critiques, and I definitely agree with them, but I didn't find that they gave the left enough. They did not give the left as much. They were not as charitable. They were as they were to people on the right, for the most part. I'm not saying it as a complete blanket statement, but that was the tendency that I discovered. They were, even if they disagreed with things that were happening on the right, they kind of approached it from a position of empathy. And I said, I mean, like Peterson, even the Weinstein brothers who are left in politics, their tendency to what they focused on had to do with kind of left-wing excesses. That's fine. That's an important conversation to have. But it was missing a kind of balance, I think, that they thought they were devoid of ideological bent, and I don't think they were. Robert Wright talks about this a little bit in one of his newsletters. And but when I read and listened to Tom Holland, I think he had a kind of a really interesting take, which put a piece of the puzzle in that was being left out of the conversation. And I want to read, I have a book that I've been reading about the Pilgrims. This is Saints and Strangers. Oh. It's an old book by a guy called George Willison. I don't know who he is, but he talks about, it's basically just following the Pilgrims, England to Holland and back, and then eventually making it to the New World. And I just started it, but there's this amazing passage when it talks about the way that they were criticized by the established church in England. The bishops and most Orthodox Anglicans profess not to be surprised by everything they were doing. And they had the most amazing insults. They said, and who are these painted sepulchres, whited walls, these Jonahs, these new crept in caterpillars, this plague of Egyptian locusts consuming all in their course? One could readily tell them, quote, by their frequent and far-fetched sighs, their continual elevation of their eyes, their meager physiognomies, solitary countenances, sharp noses, by the cut of their hair, made even with the top of their prick ears. But there's a bunch of these insults. But then it made me stop when I read this next paragraph. So most of this was patent nonsense, the usual obloquy heaped upon the unorthodox in all ages. But it would be idle to deny the frequent charge, true even of the Pilgrims at times, that the separatists were a factious lot. Upon the slightest pretext or none at all, they rushed into the bitterest of controversy about any and all things, sacred and profane, momentous or trivial, simple or abstruse, with a singular disregard for tolerance, candor, sound judgment, and even plain common sense. And I thought, wow, that sounds exactly like the criticism of political, left-wing political discourse online and elsewhere now. And I thought, I was thinking about it, and it was just, it struck me as like these kinds of things were happening back then. And what Holland seems to show is that he doesn't take a position on woke culture, because I think as a historian, he knows the stuff that was in here, and the stupid infighting, and the like just kind of outrageous lack of willingness to, you know, deal with each other's different ideas, and the canceling, you know, that kind of stuff. All of that was plainly bad, but it also bred these movements. It bred a certain amount of inner light, which allowed people to, for example, pursue the abolition of slavery. You know, the Quakers came out of the Protestant tradition, and things like that. So I like the fact that he was not going to jump on board and say this is the way it should be, but he was willing to say these are complicated phenomena. This is a huge phenomenon, and you're going to get good and bad out of this.
Yeah.
You know, does that make sense? I mean, and then I look reading this book, I'm like, oh, this is what let's just say in the Western world, the history of Christianity is just this continuous unfolding of this just mess of fighting and disaster, and people being unfair and violent towards each other. And at the same time, it's just it's like tending this light of what should we do next? What's the right thing to do? Yeah. And I don't know. I don't know if you have a response to that. I just kind of rambled for a while.
I think that's true. I mean, if your response to the woke is just to be venomously anti-woke, you're not producing much. You know, I grew, it's never been, you know, again, based on my story, where I grew up, what I saw, who I went to church with, it was never a question to me that to be African-American, and Patterson at that time, the Puerto Ricans were starting to come in, the Dominicans and people from all other places in the world have come into Patterson since then. But it was never unobvious to me that to be Black in America in many, many places was harder than being white in America. That was just never a question for me. And what that means is that there are additional burdens that these individuals bear because of racism in the culture. And I've also lived long enough to see a great number of things improve on that score, but I'm ingrained enough in a community to know that it doesn't all go away.
Yeah.
I also lived in the Dominican Republic for a time where I watched Haitians and Dominicans and sometimes Puerto Ricans. And then, of course, me there with my big gray eyes and my hair wasn't white then, but my white skin.
You saying you didn't quite fit in?
No, and my accent, which was horrible. So part of the, I also often felt that at least Peterson in his better moments was often more balanced on this than he was sometimes in his worst moments, and definitely more than how he was portrayed often by the New York Times or other people who
I think that's right. Yeah.
Feared his popularity.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I, before I read Tom Holland, I came to a lot of this when in my own denomination, my own little denomination, I began to notice the fight ramping up around same-sex marriage and how the church should respond to that. And on one hand, I basically began listening to what I saw as a more political and less overtly Jesus-like response to it. And my problem wasn't that to be, whether it's an ethnic minority or a sexual minority or a poor person or, someone who has a struggle by virtue of not being well represented by the majority of people. My question isn't that layer and layer and layer down, things aren't harder. My question is always, how do those who have power recognize the sometimes unintended, sometimes intended consequences of their quite natural actions to keep them comfortable and in control? That's how people work. We seek after comfort and security, and once we have it, we try to keep it. That's almost exactly what it means to be a human being.
Yeah.
And what I found in Christianity was an answer to that, which is a narrative whereby someone who ostensibly, if one would believe the Christian message, one who was God empties himself of all of that privilege and tells his own disciples, if you want to be the greatest in my kingdom of heaven, which is coming online now, you need to be the servant of all.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, in his opinion, the way that all of these power balances are to be dealt with. You know, he didn't run an activist campaign to tell the Romans what oppressors they were. The Romans understood what oppressors they were.
Yeah, there was no ambiguity with them.
That's right. And so Holland nails that directly and is able to show how over Christian history, Christians themselves have had to deal with the fact that when Christians gain power, they start behaving in some really non-Christian ways. And this is a regular thing. And so fairly early on, looking at what was happening in the country around the woke questions, I understood that this is a Christian civil war. The American culture war is a Christian civil war, because whereas one side has a lot of verses that says, well, this is the Christian standard for sexuality and for treating one another. And on the other side says, this is how we treat people who are, who are without power and subject to our power.
Mm-hmm.
And both sides are wrestling with Jesus in this. And how do we resolve this? Well, in some ways, church history has been a 2,000-year struggle of just these kinds of issues. And so it doesn't surprise me that both sides, at least within the church, because the big fights going on in the culture are replicated by proxy in churches, only we use Bible verses and Jesus is on our side type things instead of the right side of history and all kinds of these other proxies in the bigger culture.
Yep.
We're working through these issues together. And so in many ways, that has also prompted the shape of my work on the internet, which is, okay, so we have differences of opinion. Okay, so the questions are hard. Racism is very hard. Sexism is very hard. Same-sex attraction and the issues that it raises, sexual fluidity is very hard. How do we work on these things together?
Mm-hmm.
And most often, simple solutions over time often reveal that we didn't really solve it. We sort of moved things around and now we're all a little bit more comfortable, but we discovered more problems underneath. That's how history unfolds. And so the manner of Jesus' engagement with us, which was, again, Jesus in the Gospels, if you read the Gospels, he's no pushover. In fact, there's some times where he's just plain not nice to people. At the same time, the larger arc of the story is that he becomes the servant of all and a victim of his enemies, and he forgives them even in the middle of his execution. He asks for their forgiveness. And so it's this it's this moment of genius, which Tom Holland, I think, has showed. This has fundamentally changed the world. But the implications of this and how we work this out with respect to a whole myriad of things around which human beings will fight.
Yep.
Well, here we are. So what are we going to do? Are we going to kill each other? Are we going to we're going to put each other in camps with blaring speakers to directly yell indoctrinations? You shall not be racist. That's not how people work. And I think at the center of the story of Christianity is that how do we change? Sometimes when we look down and find blood in our hands, when, just as you said before, ostensibly we thought we were the good guys and discovered that we're not really that innocent and we've got blood on our hands.
Yeah.
It's often in those moments that a light goes on and we begin to realize maybe I'm not so good. Maybe I need to be a little more humble. Maybe I need to listen. And where can I find an authority that can wash the blood off my hands and forgive me? Because again, the old Chesterton story, which may not be true, you know, the newspaper does a thing. What's the problem with the world? G.K. Chesterton writes, I am. And there we are. And that's deep in our culture. But
Yes.
as we deal with what we have to deal with today, it's not so much that there will be a culture war. There'll always be a culture war. It's what kind of culture warrior will you be?
Mhm.
And I think Jesus is the definitive culture warrior who dies at the hand of his enemies and then rises on the third day. That's the Christian story.
That's
And
it, yeah.
I think we're still, even people in our culture who would be highly offended if you called them a Christian, actually in some ways play that out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting thing because I was thinking about that in terms of literally believing it or not. And I found that it's actually quite easy as somebody who doesn't, I mean, I feel like I have I don't have religious beliefs, but I have quite a bit of religious feeling, which, you know, are kind of two different things. Uh, I can't necessarily argue my way into this, to a belief on the days that I'd like to. But it just so happens that I have strong intuitions about it. It's just the way it is. But, you know, it is interesting, though, that when I started reading like Holland and some of these people recently who have been talking more openly about Christianity, you know, as story, as myth, not necessarily true or untrue, just that's part of it. The story and the myth is part of it, you know, and it's not as cut and dry as whether or not you believe that this thing happened versus not. You know, I found it very easy to go along with that. And I think that's because, you know, even if at the end of the day you don't believe in it and you only have the metaphor, it's like, what do I have anyway? Like, all I ever had anyway, if I was going to just be a secular person, you know, and all I have in my head are metaphors anyway when I'm trying to discern what I believe in morality anyway. So I don't lose anything by adopting some of this language, right? There's a quote that I saw that C.S. Lewis referred to that says, "The Son of God suffered unto death, not that men might not suffer, but that their sufferings be like his." Yeah. And that's George MacDonald, who I guess influenced him and Tolkien and all kinds of that whole generation of Christian thinkers. And I guess that's the mysterious part. It at the very minimum requires mystery to know whether or not that there's, you know, redemption at the end of that. But the idea that just drop the whole thing about whether or not suffering is justified or not. People are going to suffer. You're not going to get around that. Yeah. But maybe you can get around pointless suffering. And maybe that's the thing that's catching people's attention at this point. I just want to ask you before we go, I mean, you have like a certain amount of, in all your videos, pretty much, you have like a kind of like an optimism. That's like an unstoppable optimism in spite of everything. And it's interesting because when I talk about writing a book, I think you should, but I think you should be about maybe your grandfather and father and your life doing stuff, and not just abstract stuff.
Yeah.
And but actually life experiences, because it's extremely interesting hearing about the intergenerational passing down that tradition of real work. As a pastor, I think people would like it. But anyway, you have this. You've had a life where you've been up close, like you say, with people who've been suffering a great deal. And I've been, I've seen interviews and some people in real life, not a lot, but people suffering from addictions and just terrible abusive marriages and things like that. And it must wear on you. But how is it that even in the midst of these circumstances, what preserves your optimism? Why do you still choose faith and not agnosticism at the end of the day? Because it's not like you're a person who just goes on autopilot and says, well, I was a Christian from here, and I'm never going to have to worry about thinking about it again. I mean, clearly you engage in this conversation all the time with people, an unbelievable extent. So what keeps the faith turned on?
I don't think I could live without it. Because what's the alternative story? I mean, how many people are buried in the Great Wall of China? I mean, these people grew up on a little farm somewhere, and they were grabbed by some soldiers and made to work on some wall, and they were worked until they died of exhaustion, and they just were buried in the wall. And that story plays out throughout this world. And and so part of my father actually did, after he retired, he wrote a little bit of a memoir, which is it's not a terribly well written book, but it's just full of stories from his childhood, and then from Patterson, and from all of that. But I so yesterday, I put my friend in jail, and after jail, the reason I put him in jail was there was a restraining order against him here.
Yeah.
Because he had attacked a member of the church, and so he's not supposed to be here. And so because he's not here, I have new homeless people to deal with, because the ecosystem niche is just here. And
there's a vacancy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I came Monday morning here early, and there was a hot plate plugged into an outside outlet, and okay, I know somebody's here, and the gate was open, and I walk in, and there's a man and the woman, and I said, okay. And they know the drill. So he just pops up and gathers his things, and he was the guy who had the hot plate, and took off. And that way I knew they weren't a couple. And she babbled rather randomly, led me to believe she's likely schizoaffective or schizophrenic. She's wearing the clothing of a prostitute. And so then, I usher her off as well. And these are just two individuals in this world. Well, how are we going to regard them? Are they fodder? Are they worthless? In all of my experience, nobody comes into this world hatched or spawned. Both of them had mothers and fathers. Were they loved? Were they cared for? They might still be. It could be that, and in my experience, many of the homeless people around me have families who are living in homes, often with empty rooms. And the reason these people are not in those empty rooms in the house is because of one reason or another, whether it be mental illness or substance abuse or personality patterns or whatnot. They can't get along. And so now these people have been reduced to turning tricks. I have a little camera set up, and somebody had made a delivery, probably the guy's drug dealer, turning tricks and buying drugs and trying to do it in an unknown corner of an insignificant church someplace. None of us want this for our fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, children. None of us want this. At least most of us don't want this. How what are we going to think about a world like this? And if, leave it to the atheist that would say, well, Paul, you only believe this happy story because it helps, it bears you up. And I say, guilty as charged, because tell me your story. And I'll tell you, if your story is true, why should I bother being decent to any of these people? Why don't I abuse them too and get what I want out of them? Out of pride, because I want to be thought of as a good person? No, I need to know that all of the suffering of this world is not in vain. And then when I look at people like my father and my grandfather and my mother and my grandmother and how many other saints and half saints and quarter saints that I've known all my life who have in one way or another poured themselves out for people who didn't deserve it, that sacrifice also won't be recognized, respected, and somehow made right. And so, yes, it's hard to know that my homeless friend who will, I have a pretty good idea how he's going to die. I've seen it for my whole life. He's going to get hit by a car. He's going to OD. He's going to, at some point, die of exposure. He's going to get, some form of hepatitis or AIDS or COVID or something. And even if he's swooped up by someone, he's going to spend the rest of his life in a nursing home smelling like urine. I know this. But I have been raised intergenerationally to believe that there is a God who sees and knows and cares. And the reason for that is because that God himself would become our victim and not hold it against us. And so, even though I'll tell you, when you come in on a Monday morning with your pastor Sunday hangover because you exerted all that adrenaline on Sunday, so Monday morning you're feeling a little grouchy and not like wanting to go to work, and you see these homeless people, I didn't have a lot of patience with them. I was a little frustrated they were there, but then I heard the woman mumble something and I thought she said restroom. So, okay, I opened the bathroom. It said, do you need to use the bathroom? And then she didn't use the bathroom. She kept on talking. But that's why we treat each other as if we're image bearers of God. And so, no, to people think that because of all this, I shouldn't believe the gospel. No, I believe the gospel because all of this. And if the gospel isn't true, and people don't believe me when I say this, but I know myself inside. I have the capacity in me to be a person you don't want to know. I think each of us have that.
Yeah.
And so I will treat this person with respect, and I will do it because I want to believe that God will somehow make all of this right. And I don't know how, but I believe that. And so every time I help someone who doesn't deserve any help, I reinforce that in myself, that God cares about this person and I should too.
Well, Paul, in an earlier time when I would listen to people debate Christians, and I would hear the Christians give their reply, I would, in my mind, write down these notes about, I think they made a little transgression there, or what they said isn't completely consistent, and I'd flag these things in my mind. When I hear you talk today, and also just in other videos that you've had, particularly when you talk about your personal life and the relationships you have in the real world, and in the videos, I find that list I have, just kind of crumple it up, throw it over my shoulder. I just feel like saying, God bless you, instead of those things. I don't know what to do with that. It doesn't change my, it doesn't rewrite my understanding of reality to the extent that I have any understanding of reality. But there's a difference in my reaction to that. I just find it very, I'm not trying to mess with that. I'd rather be a little bit more like that. So, I guess let's pause it for now. I think that's a beautiful way to end it. And I want to thank you for agreeing to talk to me, a stranger, and thank you for your videos, and I encourage people to check them out, and who maybe haven't yet, and thank you for your extraordinary output. Put out hours like every other day. Oh my God, I can't imagine it. So
I've worked out a way that I'm very efficient at it,
and you can still live a life.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share me with your audience. And again, as a Christian minister, when I started this, I thought, well, this is the most obvious thing that a Christian minister should want, but
Yeah.
apparently it remains unobvious to a number of people, but
Well,
it is a privilege.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
And yeah, take care.